The Hearing, a legal podcast from Thomson Reuters.
Hello listeners, and today we are joined by Professor Vicki Nash from the University of Oxford. Vicki's a director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and her work looks at how we keep people, especially children, safe online. It's a topic that we've talked about before on this podcast, and it's extremely topical at the moment in our society. And we talk about how do we balance the freedom of expression with smart regulation. Now, Vicki has advised governments and she's contributed to major policy debates, and she brings a wealth of insight on the challenges and opportunities of our digital world. So what do we talk about? Well, we dig into the UK's Online Safety Act. We talk about why was it introduced and also the criticisms and objections. Vicki has closely been involved in shaping the thinking around the Online Safety Act, and she's also advised the government, and she's pushed for rules that focus less on policing individual bits of content and more about making the platforms safer themselves by design. Now, I found this interview both thought-provoking and nuanced, and I really hope you enjoy it.
The Hearing.
Welcome to the podcast, Professor Vicki Nash. It's great to see you. How are you today? You've returned from a lovely holiday, I hear.
Refreshed and relaxed, thank you very much.
Fantastic. That's how we want our guests to be, relaxed and refreshed. Fantastic. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We're going to get into the Online Safety Act, and for the benefit of our particularly US listeners who may not be familiar with that act, we will get into that. But firstly, a nice easy question for you to begin with. You are the director of the Oxford Internet Institute. So Vicki, could you tell us a bit about your background and career path to becoming the director? What led you to that path?
Of course, Yas, and thanks very much for the invitation today. It's so nice to talk to your audience. So by background, I'm an academic. I suppose that's the first thing I should say. The Oxford Internet Institute is an academic department at the University of Oxford, and we spend all of our time, mainly social scientists, but actually from across all disciplines, thinking about the implications of digital technologies in society and conducting research, conducting teaching on those topics. My own background, I'm a political theorist. Actually, I did a bit of jurisprudence back in the day, but I'm very much not a lawyer. I spent my graduate years at the University of Oxford. I've returned home, I suppose. Wrote a PhD there on topics completely unrelated to the internet. And bizarrely, I suppose, came via a slightly circuitous route, which is I then went and worked actually in policy for a few years after completing a PhD, working in a think tank, developing recommendations actually specifically on topics like community cohesion. And the OII was founded back in 2001 by Martha Balliol College, fantastic female entrepreneur, Dame Stephanie Shirley, who sadly actually has just passed away this weekend, with a vision that really sort of resonated with me. And I suppose that's why I applied for the first job, which was around ensuring that there was really good, rigorous, high quality research that would enable policymakers to better understand how to deal with these changes, these innovations in the field of digital technology. So I started at the bottom, very much sort of research broker policy role. And somehow, despite having, promised never to go back to academia, here I am, so 20 odd years later as head of department.
Great. Thank you for that. And the Online Safety Act, could you tell us, Vicki, why was it introduced? What were some of the broad issues behind that?
Sure. I mean, the sort of the precise question of why, I suppose, maybe difficult to answer in the sense that one could perhaps ask, sort of different ministers, different MPs and so on, what was in their mind when they were proposing these laws. But I think generally, the UK and the EU probably have slightly different policy traditions, obviously, to places like the US. And there's much more of an expectation that governments will step in and protect citizens, and particularly protect citizens and ensure that things like industry is safe. And in the context of this legislation, there had been quite a long period of concern generating, real anxiety in the media, amongst parents, amongst legislators, I think, that the internet and social media, maybe particularly, were posing harms to citizens generally, but particularly to children. And the sense was that there was no legislation in place to ensure that industry was acting responsibly in the face of this. So there were, I think, sort of particular moments probably over the last sort of 10 years or so, some particularly unfortunate cases where, children were significantly harmed or really sadly died. There were campaigns by newspapers, particularly around things like the availability of pornographic content online. And so I would say probably since, sort of around about 2015, 2016, actually, there'd been pressure on government to introduce some forms of legislation which could seemingly rein in these internet companies. So it goes back a long way. There were prior sort of bits of legislation which predate this. We can talk more about that if needed. But I think the sense certainly was that internet companies needed to do more to keep users and particularly children safe. And that's what drove government to act in this case.
Yeah, because I know left to self-regulate, those tech companies had really shifted their moral responsibility to prevent children seeing harmful content like pornography and other toxic content as well. And to research this topic before I spoke to you, I saw some quite shocking statistics about the fact that half of 13-year-olds have been exposed to pornography, just stumbling upon it, or a quarter of child suicides have been linked to material victims have found online. I don't know if you're familiar with that kind of research.
I am familiar with that sort of research. I suppose one thing I would have to say up front is that the research base for a lot of this actually is not as good as it should be. So in many ways, government has probably acted before it has really, really clear evidence, certainly of causal links between consumption of material online and the sorts of terrible outcome you're talking about. There are some quite contested areas, I think, that really particularly around whether or not, for example, we're very good at measuring also the opportunities and the benefits as well as the risks and harms. And the other problem we have with a lot of the research to date is some of it is not methodologically very rigorous, but sounds very dramatic and is therefore quickly picked up by media sources. And in other areas, it's actually just very difficult to gather the sort of data that you need, if you like, to unpack, these very complex questions about, for example, things like access to sexual content, exactly how is it being circulated, how is it being accessed, and what are the results of that. So that's, I suppose, just a sort of slight caveat. I have seen these sorts of stories. They are very alarming. Not all the research is good research, and we do need to be a bit cautious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've read as well that there are some criticisms about the act. So, proponents of free speech, people, from the Free Speech Union and other various people would say, firstly, what is the definition of harm? The act seems to be very, very vague about what is harmful. Is it causing offence to people? I mean, I think people can make a very strong case for, and no one would argue, the fact that children shouldn't be subjected to harmful pornographic material and other toxic content. But what does harm actually mean, and does it stifle free speech and debate about, some pretty contentious subjects that we do need to talk about? So wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Sure. And the first thing I suppose I would say is I think it is good that there is societal debate about this. I'm not convinced that we've got settled answers on these questions about, for example, how much of what type of content we think should be available. And I think those norms may be changing. In relation to those critiques specifically of the Online Safety Act, so just maybe to sort of clarify a bit further. So in relation to adults and what adults can see or do online, actually the only really real restrictions are around the availability of illegal content. So platforms covered by the law must protect users from content that would be illegal, including things like fraud, extreme pornography, child sexual abuse material, terrorism, etc. So for adults, they, in theory, as long as they're not consuming or doing something that is themselves illegal, their freedom of expression is still protected. There were earlier drafts of the law, there were white paper in the early white paper, which actually did talk about doing much more to tackle what was called lawful but awful speech, like misinformation, for example, for adults. But actually the government stepped back from that. In relation to protecting children, I think it is true, you're right, that sort of definition of what is meant by harmful content is still slightly unclear, and particularly with the, if you like, the sort of the caveat that some forms of content consumed by children, even maybe pornography, may be harmful for some and not for others. So it is by it is almost necessarily a vague term. But what it broadly covers there is In addition to illegal content, it's things like pornographic content, content that provokes suicide or self-harm or eating disorders, encouraging serious violence, etc. So, it is defined. There are certain categories of content that are listed as being, priority content. But I think you're right that within that, there may be still some concerns that it might, for example, in practice, exclude, minimize children's access to sort of legitimate information, for example, about things like sort of gender or sexual identity, or the facts of life even, so that debate about free speech does still exist very much for children and young people, but the legislation has tried to be clear about what it includes and doesn't include.
Yeah. And I know you're not a lawyer, but you may have some thoughts around how do we draw that line between harmful content and free expression, particularly in democratic societies. It's very difficult, isn't it?
It is incredibly difficult. To take sort of a couple of examples, I suppose one is around the conversation we're trying to have now about mis and disinformation, either in the context of things like health or democracy and elections. I think, there are very real reasons to be fearful of allowing all sorts of political misinformation or health misinformation to circulate online and even to target vulnerable users with it. At the same time, I much as I worry about the health of democracy, I have significant concerns about simply saying, well, then, platforms should just take it down. I do think there should be a strong presumption in favour of freedom of expression. I think the other area, I suppose, really is around children and what constitutes harmful content. As I said before, probably one of my bigger concerns is that we are, government by necessity has to make these generalizations. And I do have concern that particularly, say, for older teenagers, they may end up missing out on certain sorts of content, which actually, it could be violent news content. It could be highly sexualized or even pornographic content, but it may be an important part of their identity and their finding out about the world. So, yeah, I definitely retain those concerns about freedom of information and freedom of speech.
Yeah. And I believe you advise both the UK and international bodies, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. And how would you then compare the UK's approach to online safety with that perhaps of the EU's Digital Services Act, or the US's more fragmented model?
So with the caveat that actually things may have changed, I know there's been a lot of new guidance developed, for example, by Ofcom and also the EU in recent months, and I haven't looked at it so closely. They are slightly different. There's maybe more similarity, I think, between the UK and the EU approaches. So both of those, although they are built on the back of sort of previous legislation, which was mainly, to deal with things like broadcasting, they are both trying to address what you might call the sort of aspects of the systems or the architecture behind these sort of technologies. So in other words, they are trying to get at not just the type of content that, illegal content, say, or harmful content for children, which should be kept off, but they are also trying to focus on the algorithms that serve it to us, or the dark patterns that might drive certain sorts of advertising using our personal data. So they're what I would term, sort of systems focused legislation. They're not just focused on content. So that's one similarity between the UK and the EU approaches. EU, I think, has got perhaps, it's obviously got a larger market to regulate. It's thinking maybe more about proportionality. So it's tiered companies quite clearly, with the very strongest obligations and responsibilities only for the very, very largest companies. Another area where they, I think, have been quite forward thinking is they've built in much greater rights of access to information from these companies for other bodies like researchers and civil society organisations. So in theory, there's more scope that those bodies can help do some of the sort of checking or marking of the homework. There's less transparency, I think, in terms of data in the UK version. But you compare both of those with the US approach, and of course, we don't yet have any, federal legislation that sort of exactly mirrors this. I know that we're waiting to see what happens with the Kids Online Safety Act in the US, and in many ways, previous iterations of that have tried to mirror aspects of the UK Online Safety Act, and before that, its age-appropriate design code. Be really interesting to see, whether that, that does become law at any stage. In the absence of that, though, of course, what we've had is very different approaches at the state level. So ranging from, some states which I believe have enacted, full social media bans for children and young people, to others which, maintain a very, very sort of strong free speech, no regulatory oversight approach, and therefore, have chosen not to regulate. So, yeah, I think you're in quite a different landscape in the US at the moment.
Interesting, really interesting. And I'd love to hear more about your research on the algorithmic child. What was that about? Could you tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, of course. So yes, this stems from a project from a few years ago, funded by a great foundation called the Oak Foundation. We looked at the ways in which companies other than big tech. So if you sort of set aside, your Googles and your Microsofts and your Facebooks and so on for a moment, companies other than big tech were producing products being used by children around the home or at school, on public transport, etc., to use the internet in various ways, and the types of data that they were sort of giving up and collecting. And the idea behind the algorithmic child, it comes from a sort of recent history of scholarship, which looks at the way in which people's data is collected by private companies and then used to construct, almost like almost identities for them based on those sort of those traces of digital data. And in the context of children, this idea of sort of the algorithmic child, what we really saw was in relation to things like toys, smart toys, in relation to schools, in relation to baby tech. We saw all these products really that were sort of, promising parents in particular greater insights about their children solely based on these data flows. And so it's the idea that, if you like, instead of looking at the child in the cot in front of you to work out, whether they have a high temperature, your smart baby sock would send an alert to your mobile phone. And so, the concern I suppose I was really raising there was whether or not we were, giving these companies obviously an awful lot of power to, inform our parenting, in theory, drive our decision-making about our children, but also perhaps along the way, subtly undermining our confidence actually in just sort of judging our children, if you like, on this, in terms of the face-to-face, embodied relationships we have with them every day. So does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It's a really interesting piece of research. And what's one area do you think regulators often overlook when they are designing child-focused digital policies?
So that's a really easy one. I think the main one they overlook is children's agency. And there is a very strong assumption often, if you like, that children are, fundamentally only in need of protection. That they are too young to make any autonomous decisions about themselves or their lives, their activities. There are sort of assumptions that they are all fundamentally and equally vulnerable. And I would say for me, I understand why governments and states make those assumptions. It's very difficult to make policy across a whole nation, for example. You often have to think specifically about, sort of the needs of the most vulnerable and so on. But it is problematic in the context of something like the internet, because obviously, children aren't just they're not sort of automatons being fed content, although we like to say this, by social media. They are searching for things that interest them. They are following trends. They are they have likes, dislikes. They have different developmental needs, and this I think sort of failure, if you like, to recognize that you can also support children to make better decisions for themselves, or to be more aware of what these companies want from them or are offering them. I think that's a real gap. I understand it's difficult, I understand it's messy, but yeah, for me, that's the big one.
And could you tell us a bit about age verification policies? Because that's something new that's come in with the Online Safety Act, isn't it?
It isn't. So obviously we have a lot of history of age verification in other sectors offline. In the past, I would have had to show, if I wanted to go into an age 18 rated film, for example, I might well have had to produce a card or to buy alcohol in a shop. So age verification exists before the internet. But yes, in the context of legislation like the Online Safety Act, what effectively we are being asked to do is ensure that, first of all, companies know which of their users are children, and then secondly, in some cases, even determine, within what age brackets those children or younger users fall. So in the context, for example, of the Online Safety Act, in order to fulfill, this what's called this duty of care to protect children, first of all, platforms must work out, are you over 18 or are you under 18? Do I have under 18 users? Do I need to put risk assessments in place? So this is the first thing, I suppose, that I'd flag about age verification. I think there's often a sort of a misunderstanding that somehow it'll only affect children. But because actually a lot of this is about working out who is a child, and you or I would probably also have to, prove our age, or at the very least, answer a question about whether or not we're over 18. So that's the very first thing, is who's a child, who's not. In terms of how that might take place, now we had back in 2017 we had something called the Digital Economy Act, which tried at that point to introduce age verification for pornography services, and actually failed to do so because at that point, frankly, the services available just weren't up to the job. They raised very significant privacy concerns. They weren't necessarily scalable. They were quite expensive. What we have now, in 2025, is actually quite different. So a lot of the sort of prior debate, some of that is misplaced. Some of it sort of assumes this stuff is automatically privacy inhibiting, and it's not. And I can talk more about that if that's interesting. I think other questions about sort of proportionality and invasiveness and maybe wider concerns about access to information and so on remain. But would it be helpful to talk a bit more about some of the methods?
Yeah, I was going to say one of the criticisms of having age verification, it is people feeling that their security is breached and privacy issues around that, and so it would be helpful to talk about that. And on top of that, another thing that I've read is that there could be simple workarounds. Tech savvy young people could buy a VPN, a virtual private network app, so that would get round the age verification when that's not required, because it's as if you're operating from another country. That's my understanding. So there's been a lot of discussion about that. What are your thoughts on those two things that I've just mentioned, Vicki?
Sure, and you might need to remind me about the first one in a moment because it's all gone straight out of my head.
Yeah.
But to take that second question, so I think it's really important to be realistic here. So you cannot ever make perfect policies or have perfect legislation which nobody will ever find a loophole in. So that's the first thing. You mustn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. In the context of age gating, for example, and preventing access to things like pornography online, I think probably that there are two good reasons for introducing it. Now, the first is that if you're going to make money off that sort of content, entirely legal, perfectly good business models, etc. But you ought to do so in ways that respect the law and obey the law. So if that means minors shouldn't see it, you should have measures in place which are appropriate to ensure that doesn't happen. So that means having some form of system of age gating in place that shouldn't be easily broken. You're not responsible though for whether somebody goes out and buys a VPN. The point is you've done your bit. The second thing though, I suppose, is that I think it's one bit is keeping industry honest. The second is you're only ever going to prevent I think children and young people from stumbling across this stuff. I don't think you're ever going to prevent a really determined teenager, for example, if they really, really want to access adult content online, they will find a way, whether it is a parent's phone or credit card, or, as you say, buying a VPN, or finding an unregulated service, of which there will still exist plenty. So to me, the value in having this sort of legislation is, first, it encourages and requires responsible behaviour from companies making a profit in these sectors where laws apply. And the second is it is there to protect minors, but it will not protect them all. It'll probably only, sort of prevent accidental access, or it won't ever prevent determined teen, as I say.
Yeah, absolutely. And if a lot of teenagers or young people are stumbling across the content accidentally, then that will stop that content being shown to them. So yes, absolutely. I think young people, if they really want to see something, they will find workarounds anyway. There's no perfect legislation that will stop that, really. Yeah.
No. And actually, just to go back to that prior point, I suppose, about legislation often missing out on children's agency. So two things to remember there. I mean, the first is that, teens are risk takers and they are developing, maturing individuals, and sexual curiosity is a normal part of that, particularly as they, tend towards those older teenage years. So, we have to recognize that. And then the second thing is, from a technological context, of course, we often think about the responsibilities of things like platforms and companies, but again, kids will share, so if a kid, again, who's really determined to see it, they may well get it directly from a friend, via file transfer, via WhatsApp, etc. So yeah, we have to be quite realistic about this.
Yeah. And the first question, to remind you, sorry, I should have asked one question at a time, was about privacy. If people have to give some form of ID to prove that they are over 18, there's concerns that there's an overreach there. What are your thoughts on that?
So clearly a really important consideration. I certainly would not want to give the impression, if you like, that privacy is not a sort of really, really important right. And again, just as much for young people and children as it is for adults. In the context of age verification, I suppose, though, there are sort of a couple of sort of technological advances that have made a bit of a difference here. So one is around what we might call sort of zero proof knowledge approaches. So this is the idea that you, using sort of cryptographic techniques effectively, you can have a service which knows you are 18, knows you are you, perhaps via either, your fingerprint on your phone or a password. And it also knows that you have previously proven to that service you are, say, under 18. In that context, you can have a service whereby that provider, that app, whatever it is, can, for example, be interrogated by Facebook, who simply needs to say, is this user under 18? And all your zero proof knowledge provider will do is say yes or no. And it doesn't reveal anything about your identity. So that's the first thing, is we do now have, I think, sort of better tools which are more privacy preserving. The other side, and I'm less sure how I feel about this, but there are also the other tools that use things like biometric approaches. So they will use quite, not necessarily high quality, so you can't sort of steal the imagery, but lower quality facial images, or I think increasingly even things like voice, to determine the likelihood that you are, say, under 18 or under 21. And again, the idea would be that no information is then stored, about you or your identity by the platform that's asking the question. So that's the first thing, is that we do have, I think, more recourse now to privacy preserving tools. However, just as a sort of maybe slightly depressing afternote, of course, often, you are using these tools with a view then of maybe joining a platform or a social media service, which is going to harvest vast amounts of data about you. So, it is right that we worry about the information that we're giving up to age verification companies and their secure, how secure they are, how well protected their data is. But in a way, they are they're part of this sort of bigger industrial, data munching machine, which is still going to know an awful lot about you and your children, and you may be making it easier for them to do that.
The Hearing.
On the outside, you're a lawyer, calm and cool, but inside there's a passion to perform, a drive to be absolutely on your game. You prepare hour after hour, day after day in the pursuit of excellence, relying on superior resources, serious preparation, and total confidence. That's the advantage we give you. Be your best with Thomson Reuters Practical Law.
As allegiances are tested.
You're gambling with World War III.
And regimes fall.
Fighters and civilians continue to stream in from other parts of Syria.
No matter where the story is, Reuters World News podcast is there. We make sense of the news shaping our world and give you everything you need to know in a 10-minute podcast every weekday. I'm your host, Kim Vanel. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
So, thinking about our listeners who are mainly lawyers, do you see a role for legal education to evolve in light of digital governance? I mean, do you think future lawyers should be trained in algorithmic literacy or perhaps data ethics? Do you have a view on that?
Oh, that's such a good question. So with, I suppose with a the caveat that I don't know what already goes into legal education, I can think of a couple of areas where actually we make recommendations for sort of, advanced training actually across many sectors. So the first one I think would be helping people gain an understanding of what is and isn't exceptional about the internet. So, clearly it is an information and communication technology. We've had many of these before. We can probably draw on, lessons from prior technologies, whether that be broadcasting or, the telegram or the printing press, whatever. But there are some things about the internet, I think, which really sort of challenge our understandings of how governments should govern. And so there's sort of three things there. So one would be around jurisdiction, frankly. So, one of the things that we see so vividly on a daily basis is that most of the companies and services we interact with are often located, headquartered in other countries. Our data may be secured in yet a third country, and we may be sending material or communicating with others. And so this question of sort of jurisdiction, what laws are we bound by, is in itself a complex one. Now, I'm sure that can be legally unpicked, but I think that there's some really interesting thinking to be done at the moment around actually what jurisdiction should look like. So those sort of jurisprudential questions of what is digital sovereignty, what should we mean by digital sovereignty, and how does that affect the way we interpret or our current laws or design new laws, I think that would be something that would be really helpful. The second aspect, I suppose, is around the internet architecture. So we, one of the sort of really difficult problems for governments about the internet is that the way it was designed was not to have any sort of central nodes. It is an end-to-end network that allows for multiple information to flow in sort of multiple separate pathways across a network. And therefore, if you're a government and, for example, you want to block, I don't know, you want to block American game shows from appearing on Netflix, there aren't sort of easy sort of central control nodes where you can do that, such that people couldn't, for example, access them via VPNs. So there are aspects like this of the internet that make it very difficult to control what happens within your space. And I think, again, that sort of challenges some of our expectations of what legislation can and can't do. So another example there, I suppose, would be things like copyright infringement. We know that's evolved to cope with sort of digital copies. But I think in order to understand that properly, it's good to understand how the internet works. And then, I suppose the sort of the third area you sort of alluded to is this idea of, sort of algorithmic literacy. I think that, frankly, it's good for all of us to understand the business models of these companies. Because I think without understanding how they make money, it's very difficult to appreciate why, for example, why we might talk about, we can talk about data protection all we like, but actually, if you don't understand how a business makes money, you won't think about the importance of them being able to sort of construct profiles of you based on that data, which they may be using perfectly legally, but they can monetize that in all sorts of ways you may not be entirely happy with. They may use that profile to serve you content according to their algorithms in ways that, so I think, that for me, those are the three key elements and it's not just lawyers, to be really clear. I think all of us need to understand, but I think maybe particularly helpful perhaps to sort of future legal practice.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, given your in-depth research in this area, are you quite prolific on social media, or does it make you feel more wary using these platforms? I'm sure it will make you think differently, certainly, about the information you're putting out there.
It's that old trope, isn't it? Sort of, don't do as I do as I say. I'm absolutely sort of infallible, and I'm just as guilty of, spending too much time, sort of doom scrolling on social media as probably the next person. I there are some ways probably in which it has informed my practice. I was always very taken, for example, with a lot of research around how you bring up your children to protect themselves online. So have tried where possible, not to ban things, not to sort of mythologize things, but to sort of try and have quite open conversations about, whatever the latest trend is and how it's being used. At the same time, I, for quite a long time now, don't post pictures of my children usually online without their sort of express permission. I get very cross when the school does it. So yeah, it has shaped my practice. I think, I haven't used X, frankly, for quite a while as well. So it may be that little sliver of the social media space becomes ever narrower for me over the next year or two as well.
Yeah. And you've partly answered, you gave your background about how you got into this role, but what initially drew you into the field of internet policy?
Gosh.
Is there a moment?
So I guess if I was going to be completely honest, when I took that job at the OII, I would say it was idle curiosity as much as anything else. It was very early, 2002 I started there. And so we were very much at a point where some of the concerns that we've talked about in this program, about the sort of the risks and harms of being online, in many ways they still existed then, but I think we were also maybe much more optimistic about it. And so for me it was, we were at this moment of sort of great optimism and excitement about what was possible and what the changes might be. And having always had, I suppose I've always had a fascination with these sort of normative questions about, how do we live well and how do governments govern well? And I was just really fascinated by what that would look like in the digital space. I do think things have changed. I mean, it's a sign, isn't it, of getting older. You generally often feel a bit more negative about some things. I do feel, I probably had sort of 10 years or so at the beginning where it, everything did seem pretty optimistic. It wasn't that there weren't risks, alongside the opportunities, but it felt as if everybody was aiming at the same goal in order to ensure these technologies worked well for us and helped us live better lives. And I think, where I feel slightly differently now, I suppose, is we do have these business models which are very extractive and, which don't seem, they're products that may bring joy to a lot of people on a daily basis, but we wouldn't necessarily trust these companies to always have our best interests at heart. So my views have changed over the years, and I do every now and again have to remind myself that I need to remember that sense of excitement and possibility, because these technologies change so quickly that I think if governments can legislate well in ways that don't, hold back innovation and that do promote good behaviours, maybe we'll get there again.
Yeah. I mean, they're always trying to catch up, aren't they? Because the technology is so fast moving. How do we do that? That's and not to have a knee-jerk reaction as well. It has to be thought out and discussed, and not reacting to awful tragedies sometimes that we've heard about in the media. But these are really important issues that as a society we need to really grapple with. And thoughtful discussion has to be had about how we legislate and balance that, have proportionality as well, so we're not overreaching. It's a tricky one. It's a very tricky one.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I think it is so tricky. And, to speak to your point about it being difficult, I think maybe we shouldn't expect governments to get it right first time. It really wouldn't surprise me if, with some of these new pieces of legislation, actually they need amending, after a couple of years, or the guidance needs changing, or maybe, maybe we need a different instrument. I don't think that we should assume we get everything right first time, and these tools will last decades, maybe as they did with things like broadcasting. But your point about public debate is so important, and I don't think that's the bit that worries me. I actually don't think we have a good mechanism for that, for having sensible conversations about what are really, really nuanced, tricky issues. And that's not just because of sort of wider political context in, the EU and the US. I think it's just that, I don't know how as a population we enable people to have these very difficult conversations about things like, how much misinformation is okay. How do you, how do you address that? How do you ensure freedom of speech without without sort of, closing down things that we think might be risky for children? I think, we need much more of that.
Yeah. And finally, my final question to you is, if you had the power to write one global law on digital safety of online governance, what would it be and why? Maybe you need to think about that a bit.
Gosh. So I think one area where we have made huge advances, but I think more is still needed, is around the swift identification and removal of child sexual abuse material online. I think for me, no doubt, that is the sort of greatest source of harm to children. It involves the real exploitation and physical harm of actual children, and then the resharing of it obviously victimizes further. My sense is that we have had a lot of success in recent years in encouraging jurisdictions to work together to remove content when they receive notice, maybe that it's held, on servers in their space and so on. But it seems to me that a lot of that still works, on sort of, goodwill and diplomacy. So I suppose for me, that would be the one international law would be, every state has, sort of, strong legislation that demands the removal of this content when it's found within whatever it is, 6 hours, 10 hours.
Great. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you very much for your time. What a fascinating debate, which I'm sure will be going on for years to come as technology advances. And as you said, there will probably be legislation needs to be updated to catch up with that. But thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you, Yasmin.
The Hearing, a legal podcast from Thomson Reuters. To find out more, go to tr.com/The Hearing or subscribe via iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.